Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Ashraf. We appreciate you guys being here and sharing that with us this morning. Well, hello. My name is Thomas Bush. I'm a pastor here at this church, and I love soccer. I feel like in America, when you declare that, you kind of have to make it like a confession, right? America is not a country that really tends to support and to love and to appreciate soccer like other countries. In fact, probably 90% or more of the rest of the countries in the world love soccer, and I would be a normal person to make that declaration this morning. But in America, I'm kind of different and weird and kind of loopy and odd, and maybe that's partly because some soccer players kind of are that way, but I'll move on from that. I've played and loved soccer my whole life. I played in high school. I played in college. I played recreationally and in the amateur level for several years. And I've played it and lived it, and I love it. And in all of my years of playing soccer, I've made two major mistakes. And they both are related. In fact, I remember in college, my coach told us, you got to be careful playing with people who don't know how to play soccer. And you kind of laugh and chuckle, but it's true because he said always that you could either hurt yourself or worse, hurt somebody else. And some of you remember a few years back, we went to Ukraine and there was an international incident revolving around my soccer abilities and the fact that I kicked a soccer ball through the windshield of a Russian mobster. That was a little exaggerated. Maybe he wasn't a mobster, but it did put us in a precarious situation. I'm not going to tell that story today, but that was one of the two times when I made a mistake. And what happened was I was playing with people who were not at the same level, who were just, kids that were playing, and I felt like I needed to join in and play with them, and I shouldn't have. And this morning I want to tell you another story, actually the first time that ever happened to me. It was when I was in college. I was at the peak of my game. I was an excellent soccer player when I was in college. I'm not bragging at all, right? I was very good. I was very conditioned, and we spent a lot of time running. That's probably why the number one reason why Americans don't like soccer, because you have to run the entire time. And so we spent a lot of time running and training, and I was very good. And during the summers, while I was playing college soccer, I worked at a Christian camp, a Bible camp, as a counselor. And so we would play games with the kids, and one day we decided that we were going to play this game called multi-ball soccer. And again, to me, it's an Americanized version of soccer because Americans, we can't pay attention, or we can only pay attention to like one thing happening, right? So in multi-ball soccer, we would throw like 7 balls out on the field, and the kids would be playing, and it'd just be complete mayhem, and they actually had a lot of fun doing that. And I wouldn't play because I knew that rule that my coach had told me, and you want to be careful playing with people that aren't as skilled and as talented as you are. And a couple of my friends were egging me on and saying, oh, come on, just play with us. And I just refused. No, I can't do that. And I was pretty wise then. I was 19 years old, real wise. And so they kept egging me on. And one of them said, what, do you think we're going to embarrass you? Yeah, no. So then I jumped in and started playing. And, very quickly was able to get control of the ball. And, kids chasing around and other, there was other counselors that were, other young adults that were playing with us. And I was able to easily get control of the ball and move around and do a couple of quick moves and twist like that and move this way. And all of a sudden, there's the goal in front of me, and I'm going to go and rip off this really fast, hard shot, just like in Ukraine. And so I go up and I just kick it as hard as I could. And it was just an awesome, powerful, hard shot. And I saw this opening in the goal. What I didn't see was one of my coworkers, one of the other counselors, just happened to be turning and running right in the same direction. And right when I kicked the ball went straight up and hit her directly in the face. Right in the face. And she fell down on the ground, and of course, the game stopped. And all of the kids, 50 some odd kids probably, all stopped. And of course, they all are staring at me and watching her. And she's kind of screams out and is in pain and a little bit of agony. And it was bad. And the next 2 minutes were probably the longest 2 minutes of my life. Because the next thing she said was, as she kind of got up and collected herself, and a couple people gathered around her. And of course, we're trying to get the kids to just go, whatever, get out of the way and don't crowd around her. And she says, I can't see. The ball had hit her right in the eye. As hard as I could kick it, at 19 years old, with all of the strength and competitive ability that I had, because I was going to prove those people wrong that said they were going to embarrass me if I played. And it hit her right in the eye. And she starts to scream and to say, I can't see, you guys. I can't see out of my eye. And for the next minute, I was horrified. We started to pray. And I was begging God, please do something. Like I said, this was the longest 2 minutes of my life. And as the time kept going, slowly, she started to kind of blink more, and eventually, oh, okay, I can see. And it was blurry, and she started to kind of see slowly more and more as time passed on, as those minutes kept going. She could finally see normally, and it was just a little blurry, but it seemed like she was going to be fine. And she ended up being completely fine. But that was a very terrifying moment for me, and I vowed that day that I will never play soccer again with a group of people that aren't as skilled and talented as I am. And then I broke that promise 15 years later when I went to Ukraine. So now for sure, don't ever ask me to play soccer again with a group of people. Okay, all right, that's probably just my pride talking. So, but the point of the story is that in just a moment, in one moment, this young lady got hit in the eye and couldn't see. She was blinded. And when I ask you this morning, have you ever been blinded? Think about a time in your life when you were blinded, maybe where you couldn't see clearly, or maybe not at all. Maybe you were temporarily blinded, right? And we could be talking about actual physical sight, but then also we all know, either us or people in our lives, of course, not us, who have been blinded. How many of you know someone who's been blinded by love? How many of you have been blinded by love? Right? Alex. Oh, it's good, right? But we've all seen it. And you'll just do weird things and strange things because you're in love. You're blinded, right? And we've all been temporary blinded, whether it was actually physically blinded or something else. And so today I want to talk about sight, about vision. We're going to talk about how important it is for us to see clearly. We're going to talk about being blinded. Open up with me to Mark chapter 8. We're going to read verses 22 through 26. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. If you don't have a Bible, you can open up the Pew Bible this morning to page 844. And I want to read this before we continue on and dig into talking about being blinded. Mark 8, 22 through 26. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And before we get into today's text, I want to review where we're at. As you know, we're walking through this exegetical study of the book of Mark. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark. We've been following Jesus and his encounters in faith, really with two diversely different groups, right? We've been talking about Jesus interacting with the Pharisees and Jesus and his interactions with the disciples, right? And over the Easter season even, we talked about the signs and how the Pharisees demanded a sign from Jesus. And Jesus wouldn't give them a sign. And we talked about that because their hearts were hardened, because they didn't believe it, because of their lack of faith. And so now in our story, the focus is shifting, and we're kind of at this halfway point in the book of Mark. There's actually 16 chapters in the book of Mark. We're in chapter 8, but there's literally this shift of focus that happens in the book, both by the author, Mark, as well as the focus that Jesus had at that time and at this time in the setting and in the story. The focus shifts. Because the beginning of the book of Mark, the first 8 chapters, really focus solely on the authority of Jesus Christ. He was the Messiah, the Son of God. And Mark shows us that through many different examples. He spends the first half of the book focusing on that and developing also the setting, as well as the characteristics of Jesus Christ. And now the focus is shifting to the faith of the disciples. But more importantly, within that, Jesus is turning his focus to his ultimate goal and purpose, the cross, and death on a cross. But the faith of the disciples is again at the center of the story. You see, last week, Jesus and the disciples, we studied this last week, were in the boat, crossing the Sea of Galilee. And we're finding the disciples confused, uncertain, lost. Looking back in Mark chapter 6, Jesus miraculously fed 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread and fish, and then he sends the disciples ahead on a boat. And that's where it got interesting. Jesus catches up to them by walking on water. By walking on water. I want to pick it up in verse 51 and 52 of Mark chapter 6. After walking on water, he gets into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Interesting. They just witnessed Jesus feeding 5,000 people with some loaves and fish. They just witnessed Jesus walking on water, but they were blinded by loaves. Their hearts were hardened, and they didn't quite understand what was happening with Jesus, who he really was. He just walked on water. He just fed 5,000 people. Yet they didn't understand about the loaves. Then there's the story we studied last week. Jesus and his disciples in the boat. Again, Jesus had just fed 4,000 people miraculously. And then he gets in the boat with the disciples. And what do you think they're talking about? It's got to be like, oh man, this is amazing. This guy just fed all these people. What an amazing miracle we just saw. This is so exciting. We're walking around with the Son of God. Our faith is so strong. And this is just so powerful. What a time to be alive. Mark 8, verse 16. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. Bread? Really? You're talking about bread. And the Son of God is in a boat with you, and he's performing these amazing miracles that would fill you with faith, and you're talking about bread. So Jesus goes off on him. We looked at this. We read this last week. He asked them several questions in verses 17 and 18. I want to pull up the questions that Mark highlighted last week in the sermon. Here's those questions. Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? Do you not yet understand? This sets the table for our text today. Let's go back to verses 22 through 26. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." See, Jesus and his disciples get off the boat in Bethsaida. I want to quickly look at the map. We've been kind of following this in our story. The Sea of Galilee on the right-hand side there, if you had looked to the left and pulled out of the map in a bigger version of it. There's the Mediterranean Sea to the west. And so we're on the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum and Bethsaida are on the north shores of the Sea of Galilee. That's where Jesus did most of his ministry. That's where a lot of the disciples were from, those two cities. And so they land in Bethsaida. And the first thing that I noticed from this text that we're looking at today is the bigger picture. Prophecy is being fulfilled. We looked at this a few weeks ago. Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. Isaiah, which was written hundreds of years before this, says this, "Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. And then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." This was Isaiah writing about the Messiah. When he comes to the world, these are the things that we're going to see. This was prophecy being fulfilled right before the disciples, the Pharisees, the Israelites, and the entire world. He was the Son of God. Jesus was fulfilling the Messiah prophecy, the Messianic prophecy. The second thing I noticed in this text was how much this healing parallels Jesus' healing of the deaf man. In Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 37. Do you remember that? We talked about that if you were here. We talked about one word. With one word, epaphra, be open. One word, Jesus opened up the mouth and the ears of the deaf man and the mute man. One word. And this story parallels it. I want you to look at this. First of all, both stories, they brought to him. Mark chapter 7 and 32, Mark 8, 22. Both stories, people brought someone to Jesus. It wasn't the person coming to Jesus on behalf of themselves. It was people bringing someone who was needing help, someone who was needing Jesus. And people brought them to Jesus. It's just like our missionary Ashraf shared with us. We're bringing people to Jesus. Secondly, they begged him. They begged him to do something. They knew he could do it, and they begged him to do it. The next thing is that Jesus took both of the men aside. He took them away from the crowd. He performed this miracle privately, just with a small group of people. He got away from the distractions of the village and of the town. The next thing that parallels both of these stories is that Jesus spit. Think about that for a minute. He spit. When he had spit on his eyes. Do you wonder what he did there? Did he literally walk up to him and spit in his eyes? Could you imagine that? He spit. The next thing that parallels both, he touched him. For the deaf mute man, he put his fingers in his ears. The blind man, he laid his hands on him. Remember, in those days, people who were disabled like this were considered unclean. They must have done something wrong or bad to deserve this punishment of being blind or deaf or mute. And so that was the belief, and it was very common for people to make them outsiders, cast them off. Don't touch them. Keep them away from us. And Jesus touched them. He touched them. Have you ever felt like a diseased cast off, broken, sinful, messed up, ugly? No one wants you. No one wants to touch you or talk to you. Jesus wants to touch you. Both of these examples, Jesus touched them. And then lastly, he gave them specific instructions. The deaf mute man, he charged him to tell no one. And this blind man, he sent him home saying, do not even enter the village. Very interesting, these two stories that are parallel. They're very eerily similar. Yet there's one major difference today. Sight. Our story today was about sight. Remember, the disciples were just arguing in the boat over bread. Remember, Jesus challenged them, challenged their faith. with several questions. Let's pull up those questions again. Several questions. And one of those questions was, having eyes, do you not see? So on the boat, Jesus questions the sight of the disciples, the faith of the disciples. Do you not see? And then they get off the boat in Bethsaida, and a blind man is brought to Jesus. Coincidence? I don't think so. I don't think so. You don't think that God knew where Jesus was, and that God knew this blind man and where he was? And we know Jesus was God. We declare it every week. Jesus was God. He was the Son of God. And so I believe that he knew. As he spoke to the disciples on the boat, Jesus knew that when they landed, he knew who would be waiting for them. A blind man. That's not irony, folks. That's not coincidence. This is God. This is God. The disciples' sight was blurry. They were distracted by loaves of bread. But don't worry about the disciples. Jesus was leading them. Eventually, they would see clearly. We have proof of it. We just celebrated at Easter. After the resurrection, they remembered. Remember? They remembered. You go back and read the resurrection stories, multiple examples of disciples and followers of Jesus. Oh, they remembered. And then they saw clearly. The road to Emmaus. The two disciples that ran into Jesus, they didn't know who he was, and he starts telling them all about the prophets and the stories about who he was. And then he disappears from them. And then they realized who he was. And then they remembered. Their eyes were opened. So don't worry about the disciples. But here, their sight was blurry. And so Jesus heals this blind man in front of the disciples whose sight was so blurry and distracted. And yes, it was a life-changing physical healing for this blind man. Transformational. It changed his life. But there was so much more going on in that moment. And there is so much more going on here today, in our world today. As we hear these stories, as we read these stories from the Word of God, in God's Word, there's so much more going on than reading about a blind man being healed. God is saying to us today, open up your eyes. And looking deeper at Jesus' encounter with this blind man at Bethsaida, we looked at it just a second ago. He intentionally took him aside privately. He was taking this man and the disciples out of the village, away from the distractions. The village was just like the bread. It was a distraction. And even after the healing, Jesus intentionally sends him home. He says, don't go through the village. Avoid the distractions. He was saying to the disciples, who cares about the bread? Who cares about the bread? Do you see what is happening? Do you see? Do you see? So I'm challenging us today, us, me, and you, all of us, no matter where we stand on our walk with God and in our faith, what's the bread in our life? Certainly none of us are distracted by bread. What's your bread? It could be something terrible. It could be something horrible. It could be some sin in your life. It could also be some perfectly good thing that's distracting you from seeing clearly. What's your bread? Jesus spit on the man's eyes. And then he lays his hands on him and asks him, "Do you see anything?" The man was starting to see, but not all the way there. And so Jesus laid his hands on him again. And he opened his eyes and his sight was restored. Did you notice what happened there? Jesus gave the man a second chance. Jesus was giving the disciples a second chance. Jesus is giving us a second chance to see clearly. See, our God is the God of second chances. He is the God of third chances. He is the God of fourth chances. He is the God of forgiveness. Do you see what is happening in the Word today? Jesus touched the blind man, and it changed everything for him. I want to reread verse 25. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. He saw everything clearly. With the touch of Jesus Christ, the blind man could see again. You see, this story is more than just a blind man being healed. It's a story of restoration. See, God is a God of forgiveness, and God is a God of restoration. Did you notice when he asked him the first time he touched him, "Do you see anything?" The man said, "Oh yes, I see men and they look like trees." You know what that implies to me? That this man had seen before. This man knew what men looked like. This man knew what trees looked like, which tells me that he at one time could see clearly. And now he was blind. But Jesus restored his sight again. How's your sight? How's your spiritual sight? Open up your eyes. Restore your sight. See everything clearly again. Only when we receive the touch of Jesus can we truly begin to see clearly. Receive Jesus today. Open up your eyes. You will not be disappointed with what you see. I'm going to ask our worship team to come forward. This morning, we're going to take communion. I'm going to also ask our deacons to begin preparing our communion. You might have noticed the last few months, we've had our deacons serving our communion. We have a new leadership and government structure here at Bayside and recently voted in this structure, and it includes these men and women who were elected as deacons. And it's a beautiful way for them to serve the role of deacon. Did you know the word deacon means servant? And so it's this beautiful thing for our deacons to come forward and to serve us communion. So that's going to happen this morning. And as we prepare our hearts for communion and what it means for us to remember Jesus Christ, his sacrifice that he made for us, dying on the cross, his body broken, his blood shed for us. I encourage you to take time to reflect, to examine your vision, your sight. Take a few minutes this morning and consider it. Have you been blinded? Will you open up your eyes to the truth of Jesus Christ? And in just a couple moments, Pastor Mark's going to come up and lead us in a time of communion. I want to leave you with one more verse to consider as you think about these things and as you think about your sight. 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, Paul is making his final warning to the church in Corinth. in his second letter to the church that he cared so much about. And this is what he says to them. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test?